Hello, everyone. Welcome to What's Wrong With. Today on our podcast, our guest is Alexandra Mousavizadeh. She's the co-founder and co-CEO of Evident, an intelligence platform tracking AI adoption in financial services, helping leaders make informed AI-related investments and strategic choices. A former economist for Moody's and Morgan Stanley, Alexandra was the architect of the Global AI Index, benchmarking the strength of national AI ecosystems. Enjoy our conversation. Alexandra, welcome.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me, Pinar.
And thank you for being here. Well, for our audience, please tell us more about yourself, your background, and how you came to where you're at Evident today.
Oh, it's a big question.
It's a big question.
I'll try and keep it short. Yeah, well, actually, where I came from, I'm actually born in Copenhagen, moved to the States in the mid '90s. So my whole sort of academic, educational background is from Denmark, where I did economics, mathematics, and focused on game theory, which has come in very handy now with Gen AI.
Sure.
And so the bulk of my career has been in the benchmarking or index business. I was at Moody's sovereign team for many years, mainly focused on the sort of Russia, Central Asia, Middle East countries. And then I went over to Morgan Stanley in London in 2007 to head up country risk management. So I've been in that sort of building benchmarks to assess risk. And then in 2018, I was commissioned to do the first global AI index for nations. So measuring the strength of national AI ecosystems, which is a look at like where is the US versus China, where is Europe as a whole, where are countries like Singapore, Israel, Germany, France, etc. And so you built this index. It was actually the first global index measuring nations on their AI, and was very fortunate that a lot of people were very willing to help with the conceptual side of things, among others, Stuart Russell, who is a mutual friend of ours, Pinar, but and many others from the sort of academic, policy, and technical backgrounds that really spent some time working with me and with my team on developing the methodology and the concept of measuring something as nebulous as AI, because it's very difficult to actually put data on, what is the strength of your ability to develop and then your ability to deploy. But we launched it back in 2018 when AI was still sort of slightly esoteric for some. And I then set up Evident 3 years ago in a response to the growing demand from businesses who would like to see how they performed on their AI outcomes or their AI capabilities vis-a-vis their peers, and had seen the work that we developed on nations and asked if that might be possible to take that methodology and place it on corporates. And we then spent some time figuring out how you do that. And it is a little more tricky to do on companies because the data is not as available, and it sort of sometimes sits within the organization as it should. But came up with a methodology and launched the first ever ranking of banks on their AI adoption progress back in January 23. And we are now 3 years in. And in fact, in 2 weeks' time, we're going to be releasing the 2025 ranking on banks. And there's a lot of focus on that now because AI matters a lot. Our ranking has become a reference point. But we not only rank the banks, we now also rank insurance companies and payment platforms. And we're about to develop a ranking for asset managers. And then we might look further afield outside the financial services and look at manufacturing and retail and so on, because no doubt that AI is only going to continue to be something that's going to drive growth and efficiency across, actually any business that you're in. So we will keep expanding.
Well, lovely. I love the kind of the timeline. Thank you for sharing all of that. I actually knew the Global AI Index before I knew Evident, so I kind of were like tracking you. And it's so wonderful to hear how your experience and education and really just all the things you did around benchmarking kind of leading up to this foundational work that is necessary now in an AI world. And I love hearing those stories too, because I feel like we're always like, oh, what, like hearing people's kind of non-linear backgrounds is always so fascinating to me. I want to double click on what you said around data. When we look into, and you obviously there's major AI adoption already has happened and is still happening, and acceleration of use cases within organizations. And when we kind of zoom into the bottlenecks or speed bumps in this progress, one thing that we come across is not necessarily anything around AI or AI literacy. It's like take a couple steps back for a minute. It's more around data. And you mentioned, for corporations, it was a bit more difficult. Obviously, data is internal, and how do you therefore benchmark? But were there any other things like challenges that you at Evident you had to overcome, especially in the corporate landscape around data and data practices in order to be able to even talk about AI adoption or fluency?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, data is at the heart of this in both for our business, right? We extract the data, but when you're looking at the data as a component, very important component of any organization's AI journey, it's absolutely essential, right? Because you really can't run your use cases or any type of AI on data that isn't organized properly. I mean, there are ways to run AI over unstructured data, but typically you do need to have it properly labeled and properly stored. And in especially the big banks where the data, foundations and the data they have in-house is very fragmented, and especially the big banks that operate in maybe 50 or 100 different jurisdictions will have very siloed data. So part of the work, I mean, you can't really have an AI strategy without having a data strategy as well. How much goes onto the cloud? How are we going to organize our data internally? How are we going to make sure that it's knitted together so the AI can run on it seamlessly? And that only becomes more and more of a pressure point as we're moving into an agentic AI world where you've got lots of tasks that are being solved by agents, and it's only as good as your data, as we know. So if it's a mess, then the output would also be patchy. So the better the data is organized, the better the outcomes are. But you asked a question around the challenges. The challenges for us as a business is not only extracting the right data and understanding what's the signal for strong AI adoption. Yeah. It's operating in we do all of the mapping of where are organizations in their AI journey. Are you a leading organization? Are you a fast follower, or have you not started yet? And building such a data platform or a mapping business on something that's quite nascent. I mean, AI in itself is not nascent. There's been machine learning, or what we would call deterministic AI, for decades. Algorithmic trading, and AI has been at the base of lots of lending and credit scoring and so on. But all of a sudden you've got Gen AI that comes onto the scene, and essentially what you have is that AI back sort of pre-Gen AI could help in a certain amount of use cases, and now you've got AI can actually touch everything that any organization does, and all of a sudden you've got AI capabilities that can go into every nook and cranny of an organization. And I think that's also why we're seeing this huge shift in all organizations, and the financial services in particular, that are thinking differently about what they need to do as organizations. They have to have a different AI strategy now. They have to have it higher up on the agenda. There's
Mm.
much more spending that's going into it. This sort of proportion of the tech spend that is now AI spend is getting ever larger and larger. So that was a big shift, not only the technology itself, but what it meant for leadership and strategy and reorganization of your business, and which is still ongoing. So
Yeah.
we watch that and map that challenge that these organizations are facing, in that they've sort of got to, they've got to run and chew gum at the same time, and and it's hard, right? Because in a regulated industry, you've not only got to, build your pipelines and get the talent in that you need, and rethink what you're doing, and step back and say, hang on a second, what does the bank of a future look like? But you've also
Mhm.
got governance guardrails and governance and risk oversight systems that have need to adapt to Gen AI specific risk or agentic AI specific risk. So, for us, the challenge was, while AI had been around for a while, Gen AI was so new, and we were trying to, and we do map things as it's moving.
Mhm.
And so mapping things as it's moving is probably our biggest challenge, because where you need to spend your time is really in the engine room of the businesses, which of course is extremely exciting, right? Because
Yeah.
you're right in the sort of, you've got a front row seat to how all adoption is taking place, which has knock-on effects on the big tech, right? Because their share prices are based on adoption rates, and so
Yeah.
we sit there, actually as the sort of only company that I know of that maps the adoption rates in the big financial services, and soon hopefully beyond. So the challenge, again, to answer that question, the challenge is to sort of keep up the pace and constantly being able to evolve your criteria and what you map and what you look for. I mean, we're talking, it's like every quarter, even every month, it changes.
Yeah.
New models are used, new capabilities are surfaced. You know, Testing is evolving, things moving into production, and then suddenly there are other areas that open up, and then you suddenly got, oh, hang on a second, we can roll agentic AI out on this area, which we didn't think we could. And so there's a lot of things changing, and because we not only map banks from the outside in, we also map from inside out, which
Mm.
means that they give us their data on where they are, and also measuring the return on investment on their AI investments is something that we get submitted to us. And for every organization, there's a different way to measure the impact. And so what we also try and do is try and gently surface or produce a system, or a way in which this return on investment is being measured. And it's a suggestion is like, well, 60% of the banks are measuring it in this way. So those that don't do it, we would say it might be good to consider the way that is becoming sort of more and more the norm. So that sort of aim for us to be the global standard benchmark on AI is definitely um, evolving and emerging for sure.
Well, your life will never get boring, right? Like for the foreseeable future, that's for sure with this pace. And as someone who's always been a big advocate of like rapid prototyping and like moving things quickly, I feel like seeing the pace of AI, I became much more cautionary, and appreciate slower systems now to counterbalance what's going on with AI, really. And what you said in terms of, all the shifts that need to happen in the organization, and along with the speed of technology evolving, and your analogy was perfect around like chewing gum and running. But does that gap between, how things shift within an organization at present is much slower than, how companies want to, like the appetite to adopt, right? Like, and I could totally hear like what you're saying in terms of how do you measure the success when that success is also so contingent upon things that don't necessarily move at the same pace or even and has deeper complexity. I'm assuming, especially in financial institutions, which is a highly regulated industry. Um, Implementing something cannot just happen overnight. And well, meanwhile, when you jump into other industries, you might face a whole set of other challenges within manufacturing, supply chain, retail. And so with that, how deep does your metrics go into kind of organizational change, like behaviors around that versus the tech adoption, and what the tech is delivering?
Yeah, I mean, we measure at both ends of this, right? We're looking at and measuring the models that are being developed sort of as we speak. There's constantly new new versions of there's ChatGPT 5 now. You've got Gemini is constantly evolving as well, and you've got Mistral and Cohere and Anthropic and so on. And the models are, there's this race on the one hand to reach artificial general intelligence, the AGI, the quest for AGI. And then there is this other race, which is the race for AI adoption in the enterprise. And in a way, you would imagine that with the business models of the tech companies that are evolving the large language models, they also have to have a business model that works. So they've got to build something that the enterprises can actually use. And at the same time, they're also running fast at AGI. So it's so there is this sort of dual race going on. But more and more we see that the sort of the large language model platforms are turning very much to the enterprises and the banks in particular, because that is that's where the adoption and the investment is happening at the fastest pace. So again, I'm glad we started with the banks, because that's where you see so much of this unfold for sure. But you touch on a really good point, which is this, the fast pace of the technological change, right, and the slow pace of an organizational shift, which is absolutely true. And that's where we see a lot of the tension. And the way we measure that is when we get into the questions around time to production, from you having the idea of a use case to actually getting it into production is also part of what we measure. And it's an incredibly important metric, because if you are a bank, say, that you're putting into production a low risk internally facing use case on something that's in your back end, in your pipelines and so on, in your functions like a KYC function or fraud or some such, that and your bank has a time to production of say 6 weeks, but another bank has a time to production of 6 days of that, which is the case in between the sort of leading and the sort of fast following banks. In that question about what is holding you back, it's always down to the operation, to the hesitancy, to the time it takes to reorient your teams, to to push through a new operating model, to actually say, okay, your KYC process has 33 steps and we can automate 15 of them in the next couple of months. But you also then need that person who's responsible for that function to be A-okay with being on board with the complete sort of rethink of these 15 steps that in his or her view have been running just fine, and now someone says, well, we can automate all of it. So there is a resistance. And then there's always a governance aspect. Those leading financial services that have worked out how you get your model risk management in line so they can approve use cases swiftly, will also be able to get that time to production down. But often, I mean, and now you're seeing so many banks roll out great things such as champions, AI champions down the lines of business, and you've got training and development for everyone in the bank, also specialized training. The loads of hackathons that are run internally, and internal sort of support for teams with sort of specific, maybe sometimes really technical aspects to their training, and that's really important. Without that, adoption is slower, and so we see a really strong link between banks that have got their training and development sort of properly thought through, and that adoption rate, and therefore being able to measure productivity gains faster, is often down to that training and development, which is about, culture and reorganization. One thing we do see as a common denominator is that the banks that are the fastest have CEOs who have been talking about and implementing sort of AI strategies for many years, and making sure that they internally and externally, make it very clear that it's a high priority. Because then if you're head of investment banking or wealth management or asset management, it's in your remit now. It is part of your mandate to also have AI KPIs as part of how you're going to be evaluated. Some even put bonuses against not just your sort of financial outcomes of the year, but also against progress on AI, which I think is quite interesting to see, that also how that has an impact on sort of changing things a bit quicker. But yes, big organizational change, never easy. But I would say that it is probably developing faster than when we look at the previous technological transformation period with the internet, which took, I would say, probably 8, 9, 10 years. This is probably going to see a faster transformation, I would imagine.
Yeah, and it's the irony in, adopting the artificial intelligence is always comes down to the human intelligence involved, right? It's very human things that might get in the way. But also, I think it is interesting how this need for adoption and catching up and being kind of at this point like a state of the art, having state of the art technology is kind of surfacing all the things in organizational, maybe management or structuring that needs to shift. So it's kind of to your point, because it's moving faster too. I think it's surfacing some of our shortcomings faster as well. So I'm curious how, change management will evolve with that too. I think the systemic consequences of this is also really interesting, which you'll probably also map out in the future, and more things for you to map. We talked about, governance, guardrails, managing risks, and honestly, starting this even with financial institutions. I feel better about listening to you as an industry that is heavily regulated too, because, in some industries we can just see, rapid adoption without really, the infrastructure to support it. Um, and would love to get your thoughts on, and you t touched upon AGI, which, I think there's almost an artificial urgency around reaching artificial general intelligence too, which is kind of, that can be a whole other podcast. Um, but you mentioned the tension between the tech companies needing to deliver reliable solutions for enterprises, which are probably their biggest clients as well, and determining factor for their stock value. Um, Meanwhile, in this run, there is a big chance and big risk of also missing things because of the pace that they're moving in. And we're seeing, agentic AI the adoption has started already. And there's a big push for it. We especially feel it a lot in the United States as well, as if it's like, if you're not talking to an agent, you're so, 2000s. Um, what are your thoughts around kind of this, you know, um, I, I'm becoming more of a cautionary optimist when it comes to AI now. I believe in the potential of the technology. It can change the world, and it is changing the world. And yet, the risks tied to it, obviously, with the higher risk, higher return, and vice versa, are so big that I actually really admire your approach in kind of even defining benchmarks from, for an industry and then moving on to another industry, because the benchmarks or index or like kind of frameworks or guidelines, what we see that are being created to be able to address some of these risks sometimes feel a bit too high level, and therefore, like, how does this relate to my business or my industry, right? There's this gap that we see that is happening. So how, like, can you speak more about, evidence kind of way of going into industry first and understanding industry first and creating successful benchmarks there? And how do you see maybe, and this is my assumption, please correct me if I'm wrong, replicating that model could also in other industries or in other areas in AI could help this risk, like massive risks attached to this fast pace of AI and race towards AGI.
Yeah, I think there are sort of two components here, which is the ongoing discussion around the the race for AGI and how do you put the guardrails around that. And so you've got in Europe, you've got the AI Act that tries to address it. In the US, the White House has just put out an AI policy paper written by David Sachs's team, Sriram Krishnan and Michael Kratsios, to come up with a US version of what that might be, sort of just general policy and sort of what is this administration going to focus on. And they're quite different in their approach, but you're absolutely right. They're sort of very high level because it's very difficult to be specific about AI in a general sense, because it really comes down to how it's used in the sector specific areas, right? AI use in financial services will need different guardrails to AI use in drug discovery, to use in social media platforms, in use, in manufacturing and so on. These are, very different sectors with very different types of risk profiles. Yeah. And so my view is that it's going to be very hard to come up with a sort of a nationwide policy with guardrails that would work for everyone, other than sort of some pretty broad brush strokes on use in military and the couple of years ago, the approach was, let's try and look at it as nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And I can definitely see why that parallel back then was compelling, because you had very few companies that were developing large language models or transformer models. Yeah. So there was a hope that maybe if one got the companies to submit their workings and have some oversight board, that you'd be able to build in some securities there. But it's very prolific. It's distributed across many developers now. You've got hundreds of platforms that can develop large language models, and the focus on the large language models, I also think, is a bit of a mistake, because it's actually, if you're looking at real risk and bad actors and so on, it's actually the small language models that are much more dangerous than the large ones. The small ones that are more precise, that are fitted on a particular problem, that are tighter, that are less error prone, and so on. So if one were to regulate, actually, don't focus on the large language models, focus on the small ones. But the truth of the matter is, I think, at a national level or at a regional level, it's very difficult to get right in detail. And so therefore it has to be adjusted at the sector level. And I think, from 2 years ago, there was the big brouhaha of Sam Altman leaving OpenAI, and it was this big sort of the titans fighting about, business and the business model and the quest for AGI versus ethicists, and people wanted to put guardrails, and there was this question around, let's all sign a paper to stall research, which obviously is not doable, right? That focus has shifted a bit. I think the sort of existential risk has abated a bit, as in the existential risk argument was that you could have runaway AI that could end up, essentially harming humanity as we know it today. But I think the pathway to that is quite hard to see, because it would require so many different types of innovations that each one of them are unlikely. So that sort of has abated a bit. Now the focus is very much on the return on investment. And there was a great paper out by MIT some weeks ago that was a survey on sort of impact or use cases that have been successful. And basically what it was saying was only 5% of use cases have been successful, the rest have failed. Now, failed is probably not the right way to frame it. And there was a lot of problems, I think, with the survey, but directionally it was correct, as in what it's basically saying is that we are at a very nascent stage. We're still just pulling out of an experimental stage, moving things into production. So while the 95% might not have materialized, it's not an if, but it's just what's the timeline on that. And I think most people, and us included, would say we think that we're going to start to see the tipping point of return on investment happening around sort of 27, when you can see that most of the sort of data and the systems that agentic AI will sit on will probably be, developed to a point where it can really roll out and you can have lots and lots of agents. But what that means is, and my view is actually of the banking system or the banking sector, which is so highly regulated, is actually a very, very good blueprint for safe adoption across all other sectors. If you think about how cautious banks are, when it comes to rolling anything out, right? It goes through model development, your first line of defense, and you've got a second line of defense that validates. You've got a third line of defense. You've got lots of risks and oversight councils. You've got regulators that look at every single model that's rolled out. You've got, controls in place for output. You also look at the output, right? And you look at how that is constructed end to end. And so if you are any other sector, an unregulated sector, I would look at the banks and look at how carefully they are actually building and rolling out this, their AI capabilities. And I think could be a really, really good source of inspiration for regulation across different sectors. And and maybe that's what we'll see.
Yeah, I'm really hopeful. That's my optimist side, seeing AI adoption in heavily regulated industries such as financial institutions, such as healthcare. And even though you're not as regulated as an industry, still following that safe approach. Because also, sometimes I hear comparisons of AI to other, technologies in the history. Whereas, like, we've never had a technology that has its own agency before, right? Technology was a tool, it was a platform. So we've never lived this before. So there's no reason why we shouldn't play safe. And how that might inspire, governance, guardrails, adoption. I'm very, very curious to also see that. And hopefully your work will inspire that. And I think, when you talked about that paper, I also looked at, 95% of use cases failing. It's kind of, I guess I think it ties into what we discussed earlier, like the reason of failures, if we kind of unpacked, ties to a lot of different things that are not necessarily even about the technology. So that, that can be a whole other paper as well. You kind of already alluded to that, but I would love to get kind of this like any short, quick advice for anyone who's working in this space, but also wants to make meaningful progress, right? And I guess careful or progress with care. What would be your advice to them?
I mean, to advice to the businesses or people working within these big businesses that are working on figuring out how to use AI to the best, in their particular area of work. The advice I would give is that you throw yourself headlong into what AI can do. I think the analogy probably doesn't quite hold, but it would be, to say, I'm not going to actually get on this World Wide Web thing, this internet thing, and I don't think I will ever have an email because it's going to, it's not my bag. Because I think if you did that back in the day, it would be very difficult to operate. And And I think AI, is essentially, it's, yes, it's different, and it's a different type of, it's a different beast altogether, and it will be extremely powerful. But getting on all the tools and figuring out how can it help you, is my advice. Whether you're, very senior, very junior, if you're even thinking about it from a student perspective, because one thing we see, right, obviously we also track very carefully who is being hired in the big
Mm-hmm.
organizations. And it sort of 18 months ago, there would be a little bit of sort of frowning going on if someone had utilized AI for a coding task or some other task, right? And now I don't think you'd be even considered if you don't fully use every AI tool at your disposal,
Yeah.
because if you can't, that's going to be a difficult fit. Because if you are a young person now not using AI, I don't know what business would actually I wouldn't say would hire you, but it would be definitely a prerequisite for a very, fast growing number of those jobs. And it doesn't mean you have to be technical, it just means like whatever work you're in, it could
Yeah.
even be marketing, right? But know what tools that you have so you can do your job really well and do it faster and do it better. And I think one of the misconceptions that I often hear is, oh, it's removing the method of working, because
Mm-hmm.
you know AI can, ChatGPT can just do it for you. And I hope that everyone listening to this has experienced ChatGPT enough to know that actually it can't. You can't just plug something in and take what comes out. What comes out is a starting point. And I think that, um, in my personal use of I have found that it leads to deeper thinking than I've ever done in my life before, right? Because all of a sudden you are being able to prompt and debate something that's very clever. So if I'm trying to draft a strategy, or if I'm trying to draft a piece of analysis, right, I started off, it's like baking a piece of bread, right? You start off and then you add this and you add that. I can query things that is at my fingertips in terms of information that I didn't have before. So like, okay, so let's do a scenario where, I don't know, where Europe, suddenly has a fuel crisis, or where, AI development stops completely. I mean, these are big questions, but even if it's just something that's smaller, tweak this, tweak that, change these assumptions. How about we add this factor in or that factor in? You are able to, you might always be, prior to ChatGPT, have been thinking, oh, I wonder what this particular piece of analysis would look like if I could have these tools at your disposal. Now you have them, and it allows you to just go deeper and deeper. So I actually think that is going to help us go deeper than we've ever done before. And being able to pull in um, information and analysis that you just couldn't get to before. I mean, a silly example, right? We deal with major sort of enterprise transformation, but just down in a little example of, put 10 years of your emails in either Chat GPT and Gemini, and then ask what has changed, right? Or what your tone is. And actually, a lot of this is also used for personal use, in the sense that, being sharper, being faster, being better. Can I change the way that I'm communicating so it's really effective? So things like that. So just like leadership, management skills, is where we see a lot of this use, and all the way to, electronic trading and, Monte Carlo simulations, and, really large, big projects and asset management. You've got BlackRock has just built Asimov AI, which is their sort of, the largest sort of asset management AI platform that's built to date, right? Which simply has, BlackRock's universe and the universe in there, right? So all I'm saying is that you can look at it, from a perspective of really big transformations, but you can also look at it from your transformation. And I think that's really important to keep in mind.
I absolutely love that. I always envisioned the best scenario of AI being like I would be the, I guess, Iron Man, Iron Woman, and then I have a Jarvis, and then it's using it for the greater good. And I really hope, all the everyone listening kind of like takes that as like how does this become the ultimate tool for you, right? And I love what you said around debate. I actually use it as a debate tool in class with my students. It's very fun. So thank you so much for that advice. And thank you so much for this conversation, Alexandra. This was amazing.
So happy to be on your program. Thank you, Pina.
Thank you. Thank you so much for watching this week's episode. If you found value in these conversations, please like our video and hit the subscribe button. Make sure to visit our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz, and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts so you never miss an episode. Please leave us a comment or review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. You can find our handles in the description below. And don't forget to join us next week. See you.